Philosophy is the love of wisdom, and at first glance, it is very difficult to combine wisdom and war in a sentence, except that we always need to push our thinking and not accept simple ripostes, such as philosophy ends when war begins. War is assuredly the failure of philosophy, the failure of rationality, that is, or the failure to express respect or love and forgiveness, or the failure to seek a deeper wisdom, a wisdom that can assist making life more acceptable and understandable between peoples. The initiation of warfare is a moral collapse into a brutal existence of mutually murderous tactics on a grand scale. Yet as philosophers we should not balk at examining war or warfare. Indeed, there is a long tradition of seeking to remind humanity of the need for some form of civility to be upheld, that is, prior to war, and thus with the hope of avoiding war, during war, such as to provide forms of sanctuary for non-combatants, or rules regarding the treatment of prisoners or the prohibition of some forms of weaponry, and also after the war, such as in the treatment of defeated peoples. In philosophy, we can also aim to pull back from the mustering of the intense emotions that war evokes, as well as the complex nexus of beliefs regarding its justice, aims and methods, many of which have been embedded in historical developments of beliefs and concomitant principles and institutions over a long time. And as soon as we enter the world of human beliefs, we may again light the candle of philosophy, of human reason, to examine war. Before we enter some of the broad issues relating to the Russo-Ukrainian War of 2022, we must note that of writing, the war is in its 10th month, which means that the information flow that we garner from the media is raw and untrustworthy. And the first philosophical problem that we can therefore invoke is that of knowledge. How do we know what is going on? How do we know what the reasons for the war are? And whose voices can we trust, especially when the war is still being fought? As with any complex human endeavour, it is too early to know for sure what is truly going on. Indeed, truth is the first casualty of war. Start there and don't trust much of what you hear or read. Everything is filtered in the media. Some stories are chosen over others. Some facts are avoided. Some facts are exaggerated. Then consider that headlines are marketing tools to catch our attention and may or may not disclose what is happening. Shared photographs may be out of context. Propaganda from all interested parties is rife or should be held to be so. And to emphasise our primary concern about knowing what's happening with any war, both Russian and Western governments have quickly acted to downplay or even censor dissenting or critical voices from both good journalists and from any forthright questioning of the basic narratives by interviewers. This adds another twist to gaining a grip on what's happening. Because of the fog of war that the military and governments create before and during warfare, the casus belli, or the reasons for war, and the actions and events of the war are also going to be shrouded with factual inaccuracies, misrepresentations, counterclaims, propaganda, posturing, rationalizations and excuses, all of which should be taken at face value to a great extent. Politicians may represent the war as a special military operation or a humanitarian intervention or a fight for freedom and defence, when the real intention is control of territory and people and the extraction of resources, or even a change of government. Some of the explanations and analyses presented in the media will be intentionally skewed to favour the predator. Some are merely the repetition of rumour or of poorly researched journalism repeating what others have written, and some may indeed hint at truths. Each side may throw in abstract, derogatory names to distract the less critically minded, such as the enemy is evil, totalitarian, Nazi or fascist, as well as less politically imbued words such as they are thugs or orcs to describe the enemy. Reason and civilised speech become chained to specific narratives that governments and the military prefer to peddle, rather than being free to allow an open critique and unfettered analysis of the complications of supporting and furthering a war effort that is, after all, killing tens of thousands, displacing millions, and destabilising civilization in the region by attracting the attention of warmongers, terrorists, sociopaths and tyrants in the making, who believe that they, or their supporters, have a right to impose their will on others, or at least to extract revenue from the defeated for their own aggrandisement. The second philosophical problem that we need to refer to here revolves around the political ideologies of war, the beliefs. In many respects, these aspects are what will eventually form the written narrative or the history of the war, involving personalities, policies, strategies, logistics and outcomes from the great hellish chasm of collective violence that's been unleashed. What needs to be considered from the philosophical perspective is that wars are very rarely opportunistic endeavours that suddenly happen without any antecedent events or conditions. But we can assert that wars reflect government policies and the beliefs that they invoke, that wars are the extension of politics by other means, as Karl von Clausewitz noted in 1832 in his book On War. Politics, when it resorts to the application of force, leads to war in one of two forms. Firstly, aggressive or defensive predation, that is, wars to take, exploit, or to hold. And secondly, wars of liberation and self-defense, such as against predatory tyranny, wherever it comes from, that is, wars for freedom and self-determination. These two in turn shape the moral paths of war. The predatory war comes in many guises, but is summarised simply as the policy to control people against their will, to take their territory, to push them from their territory, to kill them, to enslave or subjugate them, to demand from them tribute or tax without representation, to steal their property and resources, to demand that they change their religion or culture, generally to demand subservience and service in its various forms. The defensive war is arguably only the justifiable war, but that is predicated on the intention invoked. A predatory government, tyrant, warlord, absolute monarch, dictator, living off a subjugated people, will rise in defence against another predator to remain in control of the people it is controlling, and such a war is understandable from the predator's perspective, but it is not something we can call truly moral. It is the action of the beast, the sociopath, who despises others, or who can only see life as a division of either being a master or a slave. The potential for mutual respect does not arise above the mutual fear that predators have, namely that there is always an eye on the other who might move aggressively first. A truly moral war is one in which predators, the tyrants, are overthrown, and a people rise up against an aggressive neighbour or an aggressive government that rules according to its whims, that violates key natural freedoms such as those of association and trade, conscience, expression, religion, and the corollaries of securing the rule of law and the sense of national unity that only a free people can express through the joy and shared destiny. Free people come together to expel tyranny, either in their midst or when it comes from abroad. The leaders of a free people reflect the deeper sense of understanding of the rule of law, not the rule of their own desires, which is called the natural law of peoples, as well as upholding the peculiar reflections and institutions of that law in the culture and customs of the people. Free leaders become statespersons, seeking to secure the unity of the people through their moral integrity, serving not themselves or foreign masters, but serving the higher moral law, as well as the will of the people when it does not conflict with natural law. The true war for freedom, not some terrorist demand to have freedom to impose a utopian vision on others through whatever means necessary, the true war for freedom is integrous and is unifying. It seeks peace between the peoples of the land and recognises the rights of those people who would prefer to separate to pursue their own political destiny. It seeks peace between nations through freedom of commerce and recognition of the dignity of other nations and their political and territorial sovereignty. A free regime seeks alliances with other free nations to create a sense of mutual strength and through freedom of trade to enable prosperity and the further deepening of the civilised values that sustain them. As a philosopher, I must admit finding it strange that such a vision of the defence of freedom must be outlined, yet the past decade in particular has seen such strong attacks on the proper notions of freedom and security and their implications of responsibility and respect for individuals, that the moral vision of freedom does require succinctly stating and restating again and again. A free people become united in language and hence in a sense of social unity and an authentic solidarity, which in turn implies a strong sense of respect for individual life and the values that bind the free society. A free people retreat from political collectivism in which the individual is deemed a resource to serve the community in whatever form its government decrees. It also seeks to make its own government more accountable and open, to reduce the potential for corruption and abuse or the pursuit of self-interest in government in favour of strict administrative oversight, civil servants employed for their abilities rather than for who they know, and a coherent separation of powers held by the judiciary, the legislative and executive elements of government. And so it was a telling sign of Ukraine's sense of unity and its desire for self-determination when, in 1990, around 300,000 people created a human chain linking Kiev to Lviv, symbolising the unity that the country temporarily enjoyed in 1919, which, however, not long after was engulfed by the Soviet Union or the Communist Russian Empire. From the photographs, the sense of hope is palpable. The symbolic gesture of linking the two cities was also an appeal for national unity. And that appeal was made several times thereafter as Ukrainian citizens sought to reassert the ideal notions they held of a free populace in their stance against corruption and governments that were not listening. The struggle for realising freedom in Ukraine has, as it is often, not been easy. In the 20th century, Ukraine was a communist Soviet, a council member of the USSR. The centrally planned system that attempted to run the USSR's economy inevitably generated cronyism and corruption, a normalised falsification of production reports, a massive distortion of economic activity, never mind the reality and perpetual threat of political persecution and even execution. Unsurprisingly, in the 1990s and 2000s, Ukraine stumbled along the path to freedom and was immediately beset by the corruption, cronyism and clientelism that had its roots in the command economy and central planning. And so we witnessed the misuse of the law to hinder political opponents, the manifestation of fears of voting irregularities in the newborn democracy. Each problem reflected some issues that Ukraine had inherited from the Soviet system, as well as new ones that formed with the emergence of a new moneyed oligarchs and their manoeuvres to secure and protect their wealth from political and commercial competition. Within its borders, Ukraine had also inherited from the greater Russian Empire of pre-revolutionary Russia peoples who seemingly preferred to look east and others who looked to the west. For modern Ukraine, nominally within Europe as Western Russia is, presents a gateway, as historian Serhiy Plokhy calls it, between east and west, and thus a pull within its border peoples to lands further afield. The history of the vast area of modern Ukraine exhibits the drama of such forces. To the west and north, its peoples were influenced by Austria, Hungary and Poland, and in modern times are called to join the European Union, like its Romanian and Bulgarian neighbours have. And to the east, by the leaning into the Russian language and hence its culture and politics. Then from the south, linguistic and cultural influences were from the Greeks, Romans, the Byzantine and Ottoman empires. Its southern borders along the Black and Azov seas have long been fought over for their access to the Mediterranean basin of trade links, and the Crimean Peninsula sits literally and figuratively as representing the fate of the grander region that has been subject to so much warfare and pain. Russian forces recently annexed the Crimea in 2014 from Ukraine. Russia had originally gained control over the peninsula under Catherine the Great in 1783, but Russian expansionism into Ottoman Romanian lands prompted a Western alliance of France and Great Britain together with the Turkish Ottoman Empire between 1853 to 56 to push the Russians out of the Crimea. It remained locally controlled by Crimean Tatars until the Russian Revolution, when it was taken by the Reds, the Communist Army, and many of the Tatar people were massacred or fled to Istanbul. In the Second World War, Germany occupied it for 2 years before the Russians retook it, and again they meted out punishment on locals they thought had supported the Germans. Many were deported. The peninsula was transferred to the Ukrainian Soviet in 1954, remained part of independent Ukraine until forcibly annexed by a Russian invasion in 2014. The Crimea renders a portrayal of Ukrainian destiny in a microcosm. Mixed nationality locals seeking independence through many storms of warfare and migrations and political campaigns to subjugate them and control their land for its access to important trading routes. The tragedy that Ukraine presents is also similar to that of Poland, caught up in maelstroms of historical logic unleashed by predatory marauders, warlords and empires, and even international war, and yet still possessing a cultural heart, beating strong for its own destiny. In the second video, we shall provide a more detailed analysis of the philosophical aspects of the Russo-Ukrainian War of 2022.